By October 1944, the United States and its allies were pushing deep into the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte Island marked a critical step in cutting Japan's supply lines and preparing for the eventual liberation of the entire archipelago. To stop the landings, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its largest and most desperate operation of the war, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This massive battle, fought from October 23 to 26, involved 4 separate naval engagements and over 200 ships. It would become the largest naval battle in history. Among these engagements, one stands out for its sheer audacity and sacrifice, the battle off Samar, where a handful of American escort carriers and destroyers confronted a vastly superior Japanese fleet. The American force, known as Taffy III, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. It consisted of 6 slow escort carriers, CVEs, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their mission was to provide air support for the landings on Leyte, not to fight battleships and cruisers. The destroyers were lightly armed with 5-inch guns and a few torpedo tubes, no match for heavy Japanese ships. Yet on the morning of October 25, 1944, Taffy III found itself directly in the path of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, a powerful Japanese fleet of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Leading them was the giant battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world. The Americans were outgunned, outnumbered, and outarmored. If Kurita's fleet broke through, it would fall upon the vulnerable troop transports and landing forces at Leyte Gulf, potentially turning the tide of the entire campaign. The escort carriers and their screen of destroyers stood between Kurita and disaster. At the center of this crisis stood the USS Johnston, DD-557, a Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans. Evans was a half-Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, known for his aggressive spirit and absolute devotion to his crew. When he had taken command of Johnston in 1943, he had told his men, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." That promise would be fulfilled off Samar. As Kurita's powerful fleet loomed out of the morning mist, Admiral Sprague ordered his tiny force to retreat while launching every aircraft they could. But the destroyers, including Johnston, had to buy time. For Ernest Evans, the choice was clear. Outnumbered and outgunned though they were, the Johnston would charge. The battle that followed would become one of the most heroic stands in naval history, a David versus Goliath fight where courage and sacrifice turned the tide against overwhelming odds. At 7 o'clock on October 25, 1944, the mists off Samar lifted, revealing the terrifying sight of Kurita's fleet. On the horizon, the immense silhouettes of battleships and cruisers appeared, their guns already training on the escort carriers of Taffy III. Shells began to land around the American formation almost immediately, great plumes of water erupting dangerously close. Admiral Sprague ordered the carriers to turn east and make smoke, launching every aircraft they could to harass the enemy. But the destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, along with 4 destroyer escorts, were the only thing standing directly between the carriers and annihilation. They could not hope to defeat the Japanese outright, but they could delay them, confuse them, and inflict enough damage to blunt their attack. On the bridge of the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans grasped the situation instantly. He knew his destroyer's 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes were hopelessly inadequate against battleships mounting 18-inch and 14-inch guns. But he also knew that hesitation meant death for the carriers and their crews. Without waiting for orders, Evans turned Johnston toward the enemy. "Commence torpedo attack." The order sent a shock through the crew. Instead of fleeing, Johnston was charging headlong at a fleet many times its size. The destroyer leapt forward, engines straining at full power. Smoke and spray whipped across her decks as she cut through the waves at 34 knots, charging directly into the maw of Kurita's force. As Johnston closed the range, her 5-inch guns opened fire. Shell after shell slammed into the lead Japanese cruiser, Kumano, riddling its superstructure and knocking out gun mounts. The gunners fired with astonishing accuracy, aiming for bridges, fire control centers, and exposed gun crews. Though the shells could not penetrate armor, they wreaked havoc among the topside defenses. Then came the torpedo run. At a range of just over 10,000 yards, Johnston launched a full spread of 10 torpedoes. Moments later, a thunderous explosion rocked the sea. Kumano took a hit to her bow, which was blown completely off. The cruiser veered out of formation, crippled and burning. But Johnston's audacity had drawn the attention of the Japanese battleships. Great geysers of water erupted around her as Yamato and Kongo opened fire. Shells as heavy as 2,700 pounds screamed overhead. One struck Johnston's bridge, wounding Evans himself and knocking out communications. Bleeding and with his fingers shredded, Evans wrapped his bandana around his wounds and stayed at his post, barking orders by voice and hand signals. Undaunted, Johnston continued the attack, closing to within 6,000 yards of enemy cruisers and hammering them with rapid 5-inch fire. She darted in and out of her own smoke screens, firing, dodging, and re-engaging like a prizefighter against giants. Sailors later compared the fight to a lone wolf harrying a pack of lions, fearless, desperate, but unrelenting. For nearly an hour, Johnston fought alone against ships that should have annihilated her in minutes. Her guns pounded cruisers and destroyers, her torpedoes had crippled Kumano, and her aggressive attack forced Kurita's fleet to maneuver defensively, buying precious time for the escort carriers. Commander Ernest Evans had promised his ship would go in harm's way. Now, with Johnston bloodied but unbowed, he pressed even deeper into danger, determined to shield Taffy 3 at any cost. By 8:20 a.m. on October 25, 1944, the USS Johnston was already badly damaged. The opening salvos from Japanese battleships had knocked out her radar and fire control systems, shredded her communications, and wounded Commander Ernest Evans. Yet the destroyer refused to disengage. Evans, bleeding from multiple wounds, continued to command from the stern, relaying orders by messengers and voice as the bridge was wrecked. The Johnston now fought in coordination with her fellow destroyers, USS Hull and USS Herman, and the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler. Together, this tiny force lunged again and again at the massive Japanese fleet, throwing up smoke, launching torpedoes, and firing every gun they had. Evans drove Johnston back into the fray. Spotting another group of heavy cruisers moving to cut off the escort carriers, he ordered flank speed and charged once more. Johnston's gunners poured rapid fire into the Chikuma and Higuro, their 5-inch guns peppering bridges, rangefinders, and secondary armament. Sailors remembered the deafening rhythm, fire as fast as you can load. The destroyer's rapid-fire weapons made it seem as though she was mounting far heavier armament than she truly possessed. At one point, Johnston crossed paths with USS Hull, which was being pummeled by concentrated battleship fire. Seeing his sister's ship in peril, Evans ordered Johnston to charge Yamato herself, drawing fire away from Hull. Shells from the world's largest battleship, some nearly 3 feet wide, fell around Johnston. One struck her directly, disabling 2 of her engines, flooding compartments, and silencing several guns. Still she fought on. By mid-morning, Johnston was staggering. Only one engine remained operational. Ammunition for the 5-inch guns was nearly gone. The crew passed shells hand-to-hand from flooded magazines, fighting to keep the forward mount firing. Half the crew were casualties, but the survivors refused to quit. Johnston's sacrifice, however, was not in vain. Her attacks, along with those of the other destroyers, had sown confusion in the Japanese ranks. Admiral Kurita, convinced he was facing a much larger American force, repeatedly altered course and hesitated to press his advantage. Carriers of Taffy 3, though under intense fire, were able to escape destruction, launching wave after wave of aircraft that harassed and slowed the enemy. Finally, around 9:45, Johnston's luck ran out. Pounded by shells from multiple cruisers and destroyers, she lost power completely. Fires raged below decks. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Crewmen leapt into the sea as the ship rolled heavily to port, her guns silent at last. As the Johnston slipped beneath the waves, witnesses recalled seeing Evans still at his post, refusing to leave the ship he had sworn would fight to the end. Of her crew of 327, only 141 survived. The rest, including Commander Ernest Evans, went down with the destroyer. One survivor later said, "The Johnston was a fighting ship, and her skipper was a fighting man. He went down with her, and he took a piece of the Japanese fleet with him." The sacrifice of Johnston and her companions bought the time Admiral Sprague needed. The escort carriers escaped, the landing forces at Leyte were preserved, and the Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming strength, ultimately withdrew. When the smoke cleared off Samar on October 25, 1944, the results were astonishing. Against overwhelming odds, the tiny escort carriers of Taffy III and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts had turned back the might of Admiral Kurita's center force. The Japanese fleet, with 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had failed to break through. Kurita, convinced he faced a much larger American force and shaken by the ferocity of the defense, ordered withdrawal. The cost to the Americans had been staggering. The destroyers Hull and Johnston, along with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, were lost with heavy casualties. The carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo were sunk, the latter becoming the first major ship destroyed by a kamikaze. Hundreds of sailors died, many more spent days in the water awaiting rescue. Yet their sacrifice prevented what could have been a disaster at Leyte. For the USS Johnston, her last stand became legend. Out of a crew of 327, only 141 survived. Commander Ernest E. Evans, last seen wounded and commanding from the Fantail, went down with his ship. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the award during World War II. His citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Survivors remembered Evans as a leader who inspired total loyalty. One crewman recalled, "He was the bravest man I ever knew. He told us this would be a fighting ship, and he kept that promise. He fought with us until the very end." The battle off Samar has been called one of the U.S. Navy's finest hours. Historians often describe it as a David versus Goliath struggle, tiny ships charging fearlessly into the guns of giants. The aggression and sacrifice of Johnston, Hull, Heermann, and their companions convinced Kurita to turn back, protecting the Leyte invasion and ensuring the strategic victory of Leyte Gulf. In later years, naval officers studied the action as a textbook case of how courage and aggressive tactics could offset overwhelming material disadvantage. Admiral Sprague himself credited his destroyer captains, writing, "They attacked with the ferocity of lions, giving the enemy the impression of a much more powerful force." The wreck of the USS Johnston lay undiscovered for decades, resting in one of the deepest parts of the ocean. In 2019, and again in 2021, expeditions confirmed the ship's final resting place over 21,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, making her the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. The wreck revealed evidence of the punishing damage she had taken, and of her crew's desperate fight to the end. For the men of the Johnston, and for Ernest Evans, their legacy endures. In naval tradition, the destroyer epitomizes boldness and aggression, punching far above her weight. The Johnston's charge at Samar remains the ultimate example. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those hours off Samar." Today, the name USS Johnston stands as a symbol of sacrifice and courage. And Commander Ernest Evans, the captain who promised to take his ship into harm's way, is remembered as a leader who kept his word and gave everything for his men and his country.